Colonel Jamal Harris, a decorated military general, returned to his hometown, hoping for a peaceful break. But his military uniform became the perfect excuse for a racist cop to arrest him for loitering, a charge that made no sense. What happened next will shock even those who've seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. In the heart of a sleepy suburban neighborhood, the air was thick with tension, though the streets still felt untouched by any real chaos. It was the kind of place where kids played basketball under the faded streetlights, where neighbors knew each other's business, and the hum of life was slow and predictable. But on this particular day, everything changed. Colonel Jamal Harris, a black general in the U.S. Army, had returned for a rare visit to his hometown. At 48, his body was the picture of discipline, a man molded by years of service and sacrifice. His uniform, crisp and perfectly pressed, gleamed under the midday sun, a reflection of his commitment to the country he had served honorably for decades. His face, carved with sharp features, wore a stoic expression, a contrast to the confusion brewing in the community. For Harris, the decision to come back had been a personal one. He had left behind the brutalities of street life, trading it for a life of order, structure, and military glory. But here, in this place, none of it mattered. His stripes, his medals, the honor he'd earned, they counted for nothing. This was a place where the color of his skin could strip away all that respect in an instant. As he stepped out of the bodega with a cool dollar bill in hand, something familiar tugged at him. It was the simple pleasure of the routine. Stepping into a shop he'd visited as a teenager, buying something trivial to pass the time. But that moment of calm was shattered by the screech of brakes and the flashing red and blue lights of a police squad car. Officer Derek Matthews, a 30-year-old white cop, slammed the car door behind him, the badge on his chest gleaming in the sunlight. Matthews was the kind of officer who seemed to walk with a chip on his shoulder, a man who used his badge as an excuse for his prejudices. His eyes narrowed as he took in Harris's uniform, scrutinizing it as if it were somehow out of place. Harris's military precision, his posture, his polished boots, all of it made Matthews suspicious. "Hey, you there?" Matthews shouted, his voice grating with authority, though there was no cause to his command. "What are you doing here?" Harris straightened, his voice calm but firm, the confidence of a seasoned soldier in every syllable. "I'm just getting a drink, officer. I live here." Matthews wasn't convinced. His eyes scanned Harris's attire, disbelieving. A black man in a military uniform in his town? It didn't fit his narrative. Without warning, Matthews barked, "You're under arrest for loitering." Harris blinked, the absurdity of the accusation sinking in. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Matthews snapped, stepping forward, his hand already moving toward his cuffs. His face contorted with a mix of frustration and anger as he reached for Harris. The moment Matthews laid hands on Harris, it all went wrong. A harsh shove. Harris's body slammed against the squad car, the noise echoing through the street. The general didn't resist, his years in the army teaching him control, teaching him not to escalate. But the situation had already gone from bad to worse. The bodega's door swung open. The Latino cashier, who had seen it all from behind the counter, stood frozen, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. But he wasn't the only one who'd noticed. A crowd was gathering, drawn by the commotion. Cell phones emerged like magnets to the metal, capturing every moment of the altercation. The scene was no longer just a skirmish between a cop and a black man. It was becoming a spectacle, and soon it would be a story. News of the arrest hit social media before Matthews had even finished writing up the paperwork. The video of the general, an officer of the highest order in the military, Being humiliated by a small-town cop went viral faster than any of them could have imagined. A few minutes later, the video was picked up by news stations. By the time the general was released from the police station, Harris was no longer just a victim of an unjust arrest. He was now a symbol of racial injustice. The first message came from his son, Malik, who was stationed in the Pentagon. "I'm on my way home. This isn't over." Harris felt a mixture of anger and shame flood through him. Here he was, a decorated officer, having fought for the very system that had now thrown him to the ground like a common criminal. His instincts screamed at him to remain silent, to handle this as a soldier would, stoic, unflinching. But deep down, something had shifted. A quiet rage simmered beneath the surface. The phone rang again, and it was his wife, Vanessa. Her voice trembled with concern. "Jamal, the news is everywhere. People are talking about what happened. They're calling you a hero." A hero? For what? Harris couldn't shake the image of Matthew's smug face, the way he looked at him, like he was a nobody. A flashback from his younger days, from times when he'd been stopped by cops for no reason other than his skin color, haunted him. But this time, it was different. This time, his status as a general meant nothing. He couldn't just sit back and take it. Harris knew he had to do something, and that something would mean challenging the very institution he had spent his life serving. The phone rang again, and it was his wife, Vanessa. Her voice trembled with concern. "Jamal, the news is everywhere. People are talking about what happened. They're calling you a hero." A hero? For what? Harris couldn't shake the image of Matthew's smug face, the way he looked at him, like he was a nobody. A flashback from his younger days, from times when he'd been stopped by cops for no reason other than his skin color, haunted him. But this time, it was different. This time, his status as a general meant nothing. He couldn't just sit back and take it. Harris knew he had to do something, and that something would mean challenging the very institution he had spent his life serving. The next morning, Harris walked into his lawyer's office with a calmness that betrayed the storm brewing inside him. He needed a plan, not just for justice, but for an overhaul of the system that had allowed Officer Matthews to act with impunity. As his lawyer, Jennifer Green, laid out the legal strategy, Harris's mind wandered. He thought about his father, who had taught him that power could be both a blessing and a curse. His father had been one of the first black officers on the force in their hometown, a man who had fought to prove that black men could serve honorably. But his legacy had become a double-edged sword. Now, Harris was fighting a battle against the same system his father had once believed in. "We'll file a lawsuit for unlawful arrest. But more importantly, we'll demand that the department fire Matthews. He has no place in law enforcement," Jennifer said firmly. Harris nodded, but he knew the real fight wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the streets. The media had already dubbed him the face of police brutality against black men in uniform. Protesters gathered outside the police precinct, chanting, "Justice for General Harris." Social media was ablaze with hashtags, #Justice for Harris, #Officer Matthews must go, and #End Police Racism. But Harris also knew there would be blowback. Matthews had supporters in the department, and the blue wall of silence wasn't just an urban legend. It was real, and it was dangerous. But Harris had grown up in the struggle, and this time he wasn't going to back down. As Harris prepared for his public statement, Matthews was nowhere to be found. He had been placed on leave, but word on the street was that he was hiding in his apartment, avoiding the growing public scrutiny. That's when the twist came. One of Matthews's former colleagues, Officer Laura Thompson, reached out to Harris's lawyer. She had come forward with information that could take Matthews down. Information about the long history of racist actions Matthews had hidden behind his badge. Matthews had a record of profiling black men and using excessive force, all under the radar. Thompson's testimony was a bombshell. It shook the department to its core. The internal investigations began, and Matthews was quickly suspended without pay. It was a rare moment of accountability in a system designed to protect its own. Matthews was eventually fired, but it wasn't enough to undo the damage. Harris knew the fight had just begun. In his final speech before the press, Harris said, "I fought for this country because I believed in justice. But it's clear that we still have a long way to go. Today, it's not about me. It's about everyone who's been unjustly targeted for the color of their skin. We will stand and we will fight until no one else has to." The crowd cheered. Harris, now more than just a general, was a leader in a new war, a war against systemic racism in law enforcement. And Matthews, the man who had thought he could humiliate him, would be nothing more than a footnote in Harris's long battle for justice.